The Cookbook Murders. A Raven Darkblade Mystery. Chapter 1. A Recipe for Disaster. The sun rose over Crimson City like a perfectly poached egg, runny, golden, and somehow making everyone slightly uncomfortable. The morning light painted the buildings a shade of crimson that was actually more burgundy, or possibly mauve, depending on which window you looked through, and whether you'd had your coffee yet. Detective Raven Darkblade stood outside Chez Brûlée, currently 5 feet 9 inches with what he would later describe as culinary confusion, eating a hot dog he'd purchased from a cart that definitely shouldn't have been open at 6 a.m. The restaurant before him was surrounded by yellow tape, which in this light looked somewhat orange, or perhaps a very confident yellow. "Darkblade!" Jenny Shoutsloud's voice erupted from inside the restaurant like a volcano of volume. "Get in here. We've got a situation." Raven took another bite of his hot dog, which was breakfast because it was morning, even though hot dogs were typically lunch food. This was the kind of philosophical problem that made him glad he was a detective and not a philosopher. He ducked under the tape, his height dipping to 5 feet 8 inches as he processed the word situation. The kitchen of Chez Brûlée was pristine in the way that crime scenes shouldn't be. Every surface gleamed, every pot hung in perfect alignment, and in the center of it all, Chef Bruno Brûlée lay on the floor, completely caramelized. "Is he—" Raven started, then stopped, then started again. "Is he brûléed?" "That's exactly what he is," Jenny shouted, even though she was standing right next to him. Her volume had 2 settings, loud and louder. Today was definitely louder. The body was indeed covered in a crispy sugar coating that caught the light like a dessert that had gone horribly, horribly wrong. Or perhaps horribly right if you were the kind of person who thought about dessert in terms of murder, which Raven was beginning to suspect someone was. Simmer. Slowly, the sous chef sat in the corner, his chef's hat askew in a way that suggested either grief or poor hat maintenance. He was approximately 30 or 40, or somewhere in between, with the kind of face that looked guilty even when ordering coffee. "I found him," Simmer said slowly, living up to his name in a way that Raven found suspiciously convenient. "I came in at 5 a.m. to prep the breakfast service, and there he was, all crispy." Raven's height shot up to 5 feet 11 inches with sudden suspicion. "You found him? How convenient." "How is that convenient?" Simmer asked. "I work here. I open every morning." "Exactly." Raven pointed with a hand not holding his hot dog. "You open every morning, and the one morning your boss is murdered, you just happen to find the body?" That's how finding bodies works," Simmer said, his confusion palpable like a sauce that was too thick, but not thick enough to be concerning. "And you fainted," Raven continued, now 6 feet 0 inches with investigative momentum, "into a pot of bisque, according to the report." "That's right," Jenny confirmed at maximum volume. "Ruined the whole batch." "I fainted because I found my boss turned into a human dessert," Simmer protested. "That's a normal response." "Too normal," Raven said, squinting in a way he thought looked detective-like, but actually made him look like he'd forgotten his glasses. "Nobody's that normal unless they're hiding something." Dr. Stethoscope, the medical examiner, entered the kitchen carrying a black bag that seemed too small for a body, but too large for lunch. He was the kind of man who looked like a doctor even in casual clothes, which he wasn't wearing because he was working. Time of death, approximately 2 to 3 a.m., Dr. Stethoscope announced, checking his clipboard, which definitely had information on it and wasn't just a menu from the restaurant. The caramelization would have taken about 3 hours at the right temperature. 3 hours? Raven mused, his height settling at 5 feet 10 inches, with contemplative consideration. That's premeditated. You don't accidentally caramelize someone for 3 hours. You don't accidentally caramelize someone at all, Jenny shouted helpfully. A cookbook lay open on the counter, its pages turned to something called Death by Chocolate, which seemed either ironic or extremely literal given the circumstances. Raven walked past it without noticing, instead focusing on a spot on the wall that might have been a stain, or possibly just a shadow. Who would want to kill Bruno? Raven asked the room at large, which didn't answer because rooms can't talk, a fact that consistently disappointed him in his detective work. Well, Simmer said carefully, Edith Eats was supposed to review us last night, but she cancelled at the last minute. Edith Eats? Raven's height jumped to 6 feet 1 inch with nomenclative excitement. The food critic? The one who gave Bruno only 4 stars last month, Jenny added, her volume suggesting this was either very important or she'd had too much coffee. Both were equally likely. Edith Eats entered the kitchen at that moment because timing in murder investigations was always suspiciously perfect. She was tall in the way that short people become tall when wearing heels, and her expression suggested she'd rather be anywhere else, including possibly prison. I heard about Bruno, she said, her voice like wine that had been left open too long, still functional but slightly off. Tragic. He was a mediocre chef but an excellent person, or perhaps the other way around. You gave him 4 stars, Raven accused, pointing with such conviction that his hot dog nearly flew from his hand. Not 5, 4. Yes, because his soufflé collapsed during service. That's what critics do. We criticize. And then he ends up caramelized, Raven announced triumphantly, now 6 feet 2 inches with accusatory altitude. Coincidence? Completely, Edith said flatly. I'm allergic to sugar. I couldn't have touched caramel without going into anaphylactic shock. I carry an EpiPen specifically because of desserts. She produced the EpiPen from her purse, which also contained 3 notebooks, 17 pens, and what appeared to be an entire wheel of cheese, though that might have been a trick of the light. Raven's height deflated to 5 feet 8 inches with allergic disappointment. The kitchen timer on the stove started beeping, which was odd because it was 6:47 a.m. and nothing was cooking except possibly the investigation. Raven didn't notice it was set to exactly 3 hours because he was busy examining Simmer's shoes, which were regulation kitchen clogs and therefore deeply suspicious in their normalcy. Who else knew Bruno? Jenny shouted, making everyone jump except Raven, who had developed an immunity to her volume like an auditory vaccine. Saucy Susan from across the street, Simmer offered. They had a rivalry about who made the best French cuisine, and Milton Marinade, Bruno's business partner, He inherits the restaurant now, I suppose. Inherits? Raven's height reached 5 feet 11 inches with financial intrigue. How convenient. Someone has to inherit it, Dr. Stethoscope pointed out. That's how business partnerships work. That's what the killer would want us to think, Raven said mysteriously, though what he meant by this was unclear even to himself. Security footage played on a monitor in the corner, clearly showing a figure in a chef's hat entering at 2 a.m. But Raven was too busy examining the fascinating pattern of flour on the floor that turned out to just be flour. I need to question everyone, Raven announced, his height stabilizing at 5 feet 10 inches with procedural certainty. Everyone who knew Bruno, everyone who ate his food, everyone who can spell brûlée. That's literally hundreds of people, Jenny observed at peak volume. Then we'd better get started, Raven said, finishing his hot dog with the kind of determination usually reserved for actual detective work. This killer thinks they can just caramelize people and get away with it. But they didn't count on one thing. What's that? Seymour asked. I don't actually know yet, Raven admitted, his height dipping to 5 feet 9 inches with honest uncertainty. But when I figure it out, there'll be toast, or possibly flambéed, some sort of cooked metaphor. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Crimson City, which now looked definitely burgundy or possibly just red, making everything seem slightly more dramatic than it actually was, which in a murder investigation was already pretty dramatic. Speedy Spaghetti, the delivery driver, knocked on the kitchen door. Hey, I forgot to mention, I saw someone leaving here at 3 a.m. wearing a chef's hat. Seemed weird, but then again, this is Crimson City, where everything is sort of weird, possibly very weird. Not now, Raven said, waving him away. I'm investigating. Can't you see I'm detecting? Speedy shrugged and left, taking with him what would have been a valuable eyewitness account if anyone had bothered to listen. Simmer slowly, Raven announced, pointing dramatically at the sous chef. You're coming with us for questioning. But I already answered your questions, and I have to prep for lunch service. Too convenient, Raven declared, though what was convenient about having to prepare lunch was a mystery that would never be solved. Nobody's that innocent without being guilty of something. That makes no sense, Jenny shouted, though she cuffed Simmer anyway, because sometimes in police work, you just went with the flow, even when the flow was flowing in the wrong direction. As they left Chez Brûlée, the cookbook remained open to death by chocolate, its pages fluttering in the air conditioning like they were trying to get someone's attention. The security footage continued playing, showing the mysterious figure clearly, and the timer that had been set for exactly 3 hours sat silent now, having done its job of being completely ignored. Raven Darkblade, currently 5 feet 10 inches with confident confusion, had begun his investigation. He was looking in all the wrong places, asking all the wrong questions, and accusing all the wrong people. In other words, he was about to solve another case. Author's note: if you find yourself caramelized at exactly the right temperature for 3 hours, while someone investigates your murder by eating a hot dog, this is purely coincidental. Any resemblance to actual chefs who become their own cooking methods critics allergic to their alleged murder weapons, or detectives whose height changes with culinary confusion is completely unintentional. The author takes no responsibility for people named Simmer Slowly who are suspected for being too normal. Remember, checking security footage immediately would ruin the mystery. Probably.